Hang on one second. I need to join as the host since Michael is out. All right, we'll give folks a few more minutes to join. All right, it's 4 after by my clock, so we'll start. Hello, everybody, and welcome to the September 22nd, 2020 SIG Windows meeting. As always, please be aware that this meeting is being recorded, and please abide by all of the CNCF Code of Conduct rules. All right, looks like we have a pretty short agenda for today. The first item on the agenda is that just a reminder for everybody that enhancement freeze is on October 6th for 120. I believe we have a couple of enhancements that we're trying to progress this release, and the new one for privileged containers that we're trying to introduce. Please reach out to anybody if you are having issues finding reviewers or kind of need help moving that along. All right, and the next agenda item is kind of a follow-up for this week, or from last week, about Docker shim. I said I would go into a little bit of more detail about the Docker shim and how that works for Windows and what that means for the project that it's getting deprecated. So earlier in the 120 release cycle, there was a proposal to deprecate Docker shim. And for those of you who aren't aware, Docker shim is basically code paths in the Kubernetes repository. Currently, it's compiled into the kubelet, where container calls talk to Docker over the Docker API directly. And that there's been a lot of workarounds in kind of the Docker shim code path and the kubelet code path in general. Some of them are for Windows, some of them are actually for other kind of architectures or projects. And because of that, it's been kind of identified as hard to maintain. So the current proposal is to take that Docker shim code, and I think the first steps were just to have build flags in Kubernetes to not build it. And I believe there's a Dockerless environment variable you can set when you're building the kubelet, and that will cause the Docker shim to code to not get built in favor of using CRI code paths. CRI stands for the Container Runtime Interface, and it was meant to be a more general and extensible way for different container runtimes to plug into Kubernetes. Some of the issues that we have specifically with Windows and the CRI and Docker shim are that, well, there's a couple things. One is that the Docker itself, and this is because, so Docker uses the Moby as its kind of container runtime platform under the hood. And the Moby platform only currently supports running, talking to Windows over the HCS v1 protocol, which is kind of old and outdated. I was looking, and there was an experimental PR that was opened in the Moby platform to use Containerd as the kind of the runtime platform in Moby, but that was probably I think that was probably about 18 months ago, and that was when Containerd was very, very kind of early in development for Windows, and that has been completely kind of untested and unmaintained. So there's still some kind of unknown or ambiguity around if that will work. But so more importantly, the way that you configure the kubelet to use either Docker shim or a different container runtime is with a kubelet flag called container runtime. And that has two values. Those two values are Docker and remote. And if you specify the remote endpoint, you're expected to give it a gRPC address or just an address for how Docker or how the kubelet can talk to the container runtime. And that kind of triggers the CRI code paths. With Windows in particular, there's a number of switches in the kubelet code base, both in Docker shim and outside of Docker shim, that check to see if the container runtime, if that variable is set to Docker or not. And if it is set to Docker, it triggers some Docker-specific behavior, which was needed to kind of help kind of bootstrap the Windows containers in general. In addition to some of the, and most of those kind of tweaks are that I was able to see are just related to path massaging, either replacing backslashes with forward slashes, vice versa, or appending a volume letter to those paths. So a lot of, I think it's expected that those, or I'll back up a second. So there's a lot of kind of path massaging that happens in order for the kubelet to correctly communicate with Docker over the Docker API. In addition to some of that path massaging, there's some of the work that we had to do to fix an issue with the stats timeout, was actually just to short circuit the stats call in Docker shim with HCS shim calls directly. And that was done because at the time, and I believe this is still the case, the Docker API to get the metrics endpoints had a 1 second timeout per container. And the intention was that it would return 2 sets of metrics, the first with a timestamp in between, so that users could calculate kind of the differentials in that timeout. But in what that kind of resulted in is that if you had a system that had a large number of containers, and actually more than about 5 containers, it would cause the call to get metrics from Docker to hit a timeout that was built into the kubelet, the default timeout for scraping the metrics endpoints. And that would result in a number of things like kube control top to stop reporting metrics for Windows nodes. And also it would prevent horizontal pod auto-scaling from working, which is kind of a big draw for Kubernetes in the use cases there. So in addition to all of that, So those are some reasons why kind of Windows in particular is interested in this Docker shim deprecation discussion, is that currently containerd is the only runtime that kind of supports being run over the CRI interface and has Windows support. And this is still kind of an experimental feature for Kubernetes. We're saying it. We've been working in 118 and 119 to stabilize this and hope to go stable in 120. But there are, we just haven't had quite the number of like scale and perf testing and kind of enterprise usage as we have with Docker. So we're being a little bit conservative there. In addition to kind of some of the SIG Windows concerns about this, SIG node or SIG API noticed that the CRI API is still in alpha, which they wanted to see that progress out of alpha before they deprecate the kind of the other existing code path. So that made sense. And also SIG cluster lifecycle expressed some concern for updates, because right now the CRI, it's not really documented how to uptake an existing cluster that's using one CRI or Docker and upgrade it to use a different one. It was always kind of assumed that nodes or node pools would just be created with a single container runtime, and that's it. So that's some of the issues that SIG cluster lifecycle and other SIGs outside of Windows kind of raised with some of this. That's kind of some of that information here. I will open it back up to the floor if there's any other questions for this meeting. I see Marcus commented in the chat. Yes, we are planning on, as in 120, we're planning on greatly kind of improving the documentation around configuring the CRI, or configuring containerd on Windows nodes. And Marcus's question was if there could be documentation about how to configure an environment with containerd and other CNIs like Flannel. Does anybody else have anything that they would like to discuss? If not, I'll give everybody almost 20 minutes back.
Yeah, nothing from me.
Yep. All right. I guess that's it for this week's SIG Windows meeting. Let's see you all next week at the same time.
Thank you.
Thanks.